You're the only one to come on my screen. Picking on you. Morning, everybody. Afternoon, evening, depending where you are in the world. We have a fully international audience today, and so we're going to give just a couple of minutes to let a few more people join, and then we will begin. Abby, can you remind me, is this going to Facebook and LinkedIn?
It's not being streamed, no.
It's not being streamed.
Just here. But we have got Andre here, so we have got him watching it for the socials.
Hi, Andrew. Beginning to have a slowdown of people joining.
I would say you're good to start.
David, are you ready?
Yes.
Great. Are you sharing slides at the moment, David?
Yes, I am. Can you see them?
Yes, I can
see
now.
them, David.
Yeah, brilliant, excellent.
Thank you very much. Welcome everybody to this webinar. I wonder if I could please ask, if you're not on mute, to please put yourselves on mute, or just check that you're on mute, to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and to ask you to put any questions into the chat. We have three of us from the team working on this webinar this morning. Andrew McClelland, who many of you will know from the work that he does in the National Consortium for Societal Resilience. Andrew's going to be monitoring the chat, and we'll be bringing some questions into the presentation during that, as they arise. Myself, I'm Duncan Shaw from the University of Manchester, and I've been working on this project with David around recovery, renewal, resilience. There's a wide team of people at Manchester. I think Roisin's on the call, and there are a whole other group that you can find on our website. If you type in recovery, renewal, resilience Manchester, then you'll be able to find out the sorts of work that we've been doing. But this is a presentation that brings together all of the work that we've been doing over the last few years. But before I get into that, David, I wonder if you'd like to introduce yourself, please.
Thanks, Duncan. Yeah, good morning, everybody. I'm David Powell, also working at the University of Manchester with Duncan and the brilliant team at the university. Duncan and I have known each other probably for the last 10 years. And I think we've been in this space around resilience, recovery, evacuation, vulnerable people, over a fascinating journey, which all culminated, of course, with the COVID experience we want to share with you today. But, delighted to be with you. Thank you for showing the interest in the webinar this morning, and look forward to chatting through with you over the next 2 hours. Thanks, Duncan.
So, David, obviously we've got a very international audience, as I said at the beginning. There are some terms that we were wanting to sort of pick up on, like local resilience forum, because that's a term that we're going to be using throughout. I wonder if you just give us a quick intro to an LRF.
Yes, the audience is a magnificent one, frankly, but we recognise that not all of you are from the UK. So just to explain a term that we may use throughout the presentation of LRF, or Local Resilience Forum, just to explain that here in the UK, it is effectively the multi-agency partnership that is given the duties to plan for and respond to, recover from major emergencies, civil disruptions, civil emergencies that we have here in the UK. But you'll recognise it as being a collection of the emergency services, local government partners, colleagues, partners, friends from the voluntary sector, health partners, the Environment Agency, all of the kind of agencies that you would expect would have a role to help in responding to emergencies and indeed to preventing them happening in the first place and building resilience, which is a key feature for our talk to you today. So if we refer to LRF, please think about any form of resilience partnership that you will recognise within your own sphere of operation or influence. So we have also worked, for example, as Duncan will go on to explain, in fairly kind of varied parts of the globe, so including South America, North America, right the way through to the Palestinian Authority on the occupied West Bank. So, we recognise the term can be applied. In fact, all of the learning today we think can be applied globally, not just locally here in the UK. Duncan, does that explain that one, do you think? Well,
yeah, absolutely. And with that in mind, it was these local resilience forums that we were working during this project. So the slide that you can see on the screen charts the project really in a bit of an infographic. We began by developing a recovery framework. So we developed an international standard, we pulled together a whole range of interviews from across the UK. We provided expert insight into various different places, as well as received that from a whole host of different actors. We conducted an interview series of nearly 150 interviews, and we did a huge number of webinars and got lots and lots of feedback from that. The project involved a large number of academics. It involved us getting involved in meetings and all across the world. And as David mentioned, we're particularly interested and pleased to be involved in some of the countries you can see on this little map, both helping and learning about what they were doing. And we took all of that material during the project and moved over onto this other side of the diagram, the white side, and we produced what we called the Manchester Briefing. And this pulled together lessons for recovery and renewal, all the idea of building resilience. And if you haven't had the Manchester Briefing, then when it was about 52 issues of that document. It went out to a global audience through a whole network of partners. The Resilient Cities Network was one of the key partners that we worked with to distribute it to all of their partner cities and then some. And so we worked through UN, through Emerging Planning Society, LGA, SOLACE, a whole range of different organisations. And we have only just recently started up the Manchester Briefing again, because this project led to the formation of the National Consortium for Societal Resilience, this circle that's in the middle. And what we realised was that recovery, renewal, resilience, what could we do in terms of our team around renewing our effort? And we realised that was around societal resilience. As David said, we've been working in this area for many years. And so now we have and are very delighted to be involved in the consortium, which is pretty much every LRF in the country, key partners from the voluntary sector, from business, from government, all coming together to think about societal resilience. And so what we're going to do during this presentation is really focus on the recovery and the renewal aspects. But then towards the end, we will start talking about how we're expressing that through the societal resilience work that we're also doing. David, I mentioned a little earlier the international standard. We wrote the international standard, and because it was during COVID, we did it in record time. And for any of you who are thinking about recovery and renewal, then feel free to download this document. It's ISO 22393. I'm not going to go through this slide, there's too much on it. But what this document does is it takes you through the process that we developed for recovery and renewal, and about planning recovery and renewal. This is a process that we worked in various LRFs in the UK on. The first country to pick up on the international standard was Palestine, and we worked very closely with the Ramallah municipality to implement the international standard in that country. And through that, we learned more about what recovery real means, and feeding that into this presentation and to our ongoing work. David, the next slide. Next slide, please.
Okay, so you know, whilst we were producing the ISO and enjoying the relationships across the globe and learning from what people were doing during COVID, we also concentrated here in the UK on a exciting piece of research, I think, that involved Duncan and I both sitting in on numerous recovery meetings, renewal meetings throughout the 2 years of the COVID pandemic, both at national level, but also very much down at the local resilience forum level that I described to you earlier on. We also contributed towards recovery networks, the kind of support functions here that were trying to help people work out what recovery would look like during COVID. And we followed that all up with some fairly unique insights from leaders who were responsible for managing, delivering, coordinating recovery in the UK. So 30 strategic recovery leads and their support functions, advisors, in over 18 of the local resilience forums. For those of you not UK based, that's just under 50% of all of the partnerships in England. So a really good kind of sample size. And we wanted to learn from them what their experiences were. What did they learn? What did they take away? What did they feel would be the future for strengthening resilience beyond the COVID experience? So, you know, some of the insights were shared across a variety of structures. We have some complicated structures in the UK, it would be fair to say. We captured experiences across major metropolitan city areas, combined authorities, for example, and some of the more challenging rural landscapes where you have a variety of local government structures, for example, that do add a degree of complication into the way that you would organise multi-agency partnerships. But we also importantly looked at some of their interactions with non-coterminous partners, so people who didn't necessarily fit within the footprint of the Resilience Forum that I've described to you a little bit earlier, and also how they interact with both national and subnational levels of support, and how did we make sure that the kind of very good, very generous offers that were being made at a national, subnational level could fit into the local needs. So a really exciting piece of research, which we're recently coming to the end of. We will be producing and publishing a number of academic journal articles, but the purpose of today, I think, is to have more of a conversational description, interaction with you that just shares some of our observations, very much based on the insights from those leaders and all of that international work that Duncan described in the previous slide. Duncan, I think we just need to go through some basic principles, I guess, before we go into the findings.
Yeah, absolutely. And the first is really trying to explain to you what we mean by recovery. So what we saw during COVID was a huge amount of effort on response, and you know, the effort across the world was just extraordinary. And recovery was unlike any other recovery that we have observed. You know, it wasn't recovery to some other emergency like a flood or a building collapse. This was something quite different. And when we talk about recovery in the context of COVID, we mean relatively short term, and it's putting and addressing these urgent fragilities that we see. So, for example, organisations getting back to a state of preparedness. And this is not about starting to tackle some of the chronic inequalities that we see. This is about some relatively transactional activities. And what those are doing are making sure that you're back up and running and able to be prepared for the next emergency when it happens. So 3 aspects that we saw to this was firstly taking an opportunity to reflect and to learn. So we saw this was absolutely key. It was about taking time to pause and to reflect and to think about, well, what is recovery in the context of COVID? And certainly everybody that we were talking to in local authorities and in recovery coordination groups, we were saying you need that time. You need the time to set things up, to start on a pathway of recovery. So it wasn't about running with a frantic pace of response straight into a new frantic pace of recovery. It was about taking some time and taking a very strategic approach of moving into something of the aftermath of COVID. That part of that was about negotiating who's going to take responsibility for recovery and thinking about how you wanted to recognise and remember those that have been affected so difficultly and so dramatically by the awful events that we saw during COVID. The second part was about reviewing preparedness, which was about saying, well, are we ready for the next crisis? You know, how ready are we? Where are the new fragilities in our system that we need to address? And for many, that was a relatively straightforward process, and just some transactional activities to make sure that that readiness was available then, and to reinstate operations. So in some cases, it was starting up activities that had been paused, that had been halted or that had been paused during COVID, and starting these things up again so that businesses could get back to usual. But very much recovery was about this focus on preparedness, on getting ready for the next event happening. The alternative that we were suggesting was, well, there's recovery, which is all this transactional stuff, but then there's something much bigger than that, and we called that renewal. And we struggled with the terminology around it because people were saying, well, recovery is not enough. We want to go far broader than that. We want to address some of these inequalities that COVID has exposed. We want to do something much more ambitious. It's not recovery. And so we titled this renewal. And the term recovery, renewal, resilience was saying that recovery and renewal both point towards resilience. In that context, renewal is all about transformational. It's all about doing something that is significantly different, that is not transactional, that is very strategic, that is addressing the inequalities that you've seen in order to build that resilience back into your system. We saw that renewal was around people. So it was looking at how workers, how customers, how staff, how members of the public, how they had been affected, and trying to think about a new future with them for what that means. We saw obviously that places were affected hugely. Places, their purpose had been changed. They had relocated operations. People had started working at home and using different places as offices. People had moved out of cities or into cities. There was a huge movement of people in different ways. And so there needed to be some rethinking as to what our places are and what our city centres need to be and what transport needed to be and how we got there. Processes, so reshaping and reorganising how we had done things. Processes and organisations had changed significantly. And some were saying, well, we don't want to go back to the old way of working. We want to move forward. So then what does that mean? Not in an emergency footing, but what does it mean if that became a new business as usual? And then repair of the system and thinking across people, places and processes and thinking about how we needed to take quite a significantly different approach to living. And again, all of this was focusing on resilience. So focusing on that ability to absorb what had happened, to adapt in a changing environment, so that we weren't just recovering, we weren't just doing renewal for something different. We were doing recovery and renewal in order to build our resilience of our system, in order to make sure that we were able to absorb in the ways that I've just described. David.
Thanks for that, Duncan. Yeah, so look, we've kind of introduced the journey that we've taken, the experiences that we've enjoyed along the last few years. So let me just share with you now what we're going to talk about going forward throughout the presentation, and we'll take a number of pauses. By the way, I want to give Duncan and I a little bit of a break from speaking, but also just to make sure that if there's any urgent questions that come up, we can quickly deal with them, which Andrew will help with. But so going forward, we want to reflect then on exactly what it was that COVID taught us. And we ask what we think is a quite critical question looking ahead. Look, was this just a fire drill, or is it just a new class in public health emergencies? And if so, what does that tell us about dealing with future acute stresses, chronic shocks that may be facing us, certainly around climate challenges, cost of living, all the things that you might already be seeing as potential future threats. Specifically, we're going to share with you some thoughts about how we thought recovery, renewal and resilience played out and the lessons that we would share with you going forward, which leads us nicely into describing what we call new narratives for opening up resilience. There's an awful lot of work globally, a really good, ambitious, very energetic shift, I think, to recognise that making people more resilient to these challenges and disruptions is the key way forward, rather than always just responding to them, for example. We're going to describe to you what we call meaningful recovery. So a public health pandemic challenge over a prolonged period clearly is something extraordinary. It's not the same as a localized flooding event where it's about salvage, putting things back into place and then rebuilding. This had something much deeper, some of those underlying inequalities, fragilities that Duncan mentioned before. So in the context of a health emergency, we'll try to describe to you what we think meaningful recovery looks like. And then we're going to do, which we think is the most important part of the conversation, the journey we're on now, is we wanted just to share with you a little bit more about how do you deliver strategic societal resilience across a whole system, and leave you with some key messages right at the very end about how we think the ecosystem for delivering societal resilience can be refined and reshaped. And again, importantly to remind you, we think these lessons are global. We don't think they're unique to the UK. In fact, we understand the challenges pretty much look the same. The policy context and the structure may be slightly different, but in reality, the challenges are almost identical. So we think these lessons have wide application. Now, Duncan, you mentioned at the beginning, the first step really was to reflect and learn. So we were going to share some slides, just take you back through the kind of unique and quite enormous response to the COVID emergency. But I just wondered if you wanted to come in at that point, Duncan, or were you okay?
Yeah, I was just going to mention that the UK government have issued a UK resilience framework, which is very much thinking about this what the new path for resilience looks like in the UK. And they've mentioned a number of things in that document, which talks about how can resilience change and the role of the local resilience forums. We think that the document is a great start in identifying a new path and a new journey that we're going to be taking as a country around that. If you haven't seen that document, it's really worth a read, because it very much aligns with some of the content of this presentation in terms of, well, where can the UK be going and in terms of building that resilience.
Thanks, Duncan. So I'll let your eyes just scan over the slide that's on the screen now, and the graphic on the right really is a collection of the kind of activities that resilience partnerships here in the UK were busily managing, but actually also as we started to talk to Vancouver, to Ramallah, to New Zealand, Italy and elsewhere, pretty much everybody was trying to do this kind of activity in the immediate urgent response phase. But going back into the UK and the interviews with the 30 leaders in particular, we would describe this as being a nationally led public health emergency over 2 years, with the public perception in the UK and actually probably in most countries being very much driven by national government communications. Now that's quite unique. It's very, very rare, extremely rare, that you'll have a complete nationwide prolonged emergency of this nature. So very unique in itself. Here in the UK, the focus was particularly and expressly on the economy and protecting the single service, the National Health Service, for those of you who are familiar with that structure here. But in doing so, that overturned some of the norms of emergency management. And that we think led to a slightly delayed engagement that would be usual for some of the resilience partnerships in the UK. And again, that were engaged in this kind of began to think about what it meant for the status of LRS. And we'll come back to the nature of these partnerships a little bit later, but were they seen as being trusted partners in those first early days, or was it literally because it was such a unique event, new structures were being formed around the traditional ways of dealing with emergencies? But certainly if you look at the graphic on the right hand side, all the roles, all the activities we're describing here and the continuity of service management that Duncan mentioned earlier on, they're all very secondary roles within the public health pandemic that was being dealt with here in the UK. But in particular, it really highlighted, I think, not uniquely, but certainly in a large scale way, the absolute interdependence between all sectors, services and systems. I mean, it was a truly corporate response that did, you know, every part of the UK system, you know, your normal way of living life was affected by this particular pandemic. And of course, that in itself quickly highlights the fact that you need to align so many agendas beyond just dealing with response and recovery to an emergency, because so much more of society was being impacted. The complexity of the pandemic itself really challenged systems, certainly here in the UK, and it led to a number of you know, different management approaches that show great agility, flexibility. Actually, we were admiring, I think, the way that resilience partnerships responded and reshaped themselves to be able to deal with what was a unique threat to them. A greater appetite for dealing with risk and finding new ways of working amongst different services who would not traditionally have been involved in emergency response, but were suddenly, you know, thrown into the spotlight. So, you know, we think it was a fantastic example of partners coming together and just learning and quickly finding new ways of dealing with what was a fairly complex challenge. Of course, this was all happening at the time of seismic disruptions, relentless waves. You know, here in the UK, 3 significant waves leading to 3 individual sections of lockdown, which brought its own challenges around control measures, and of course concurrent events, because other disasters carried on happening throughout the world and indeed here in the UK. We also found that there was an incredible addictive pace to response, and of course that it was always going to lead to a degree of fatigue amongst LRFs. And certainly here in the UK, it's felt like resilience partnerships have been in almost like a semi-permanent because of the EU transition challenges over the preceding years, COVID, of course, over a good intense 2-year period, and of course now ongoing with Ukraine and the refugee challenges that I think we're all facing. The prolonged and kind of non-linear nature of the pandemic, I think, also often made it very difficult to discern between what was response and actually what was recovery. And when you look back on it, an awful lot of the challenges were more about continuity rather than they were about specifically response or recovery. So it made it incredibly difficult for partners to get their heads around exactly what phase they were in. And of course, what that really meant was that in the context of the early days, certainly reinstating services, continuity of infrastructure and services came to the fore, getting back to business as usual. And of course, then that growing understanding of the emerging and the longer term impacts beyond the pandemic really started to surface, I think, you know, good 6 months, 9 months into the challenge itself. Duncan, I wonder if you'd just talk a little bit, if you wouldn't mind, please, about the concept of vulnerability, because I think this is one of the key things that struck us early on in the experiences.
Yeah, so we had this phrase of the pandemic brought the concept of vulnerability to everybody's doorstep. Essentially, nobody was unaffected by it, which, as David said, it's incredibly unusual that we all felt equally as challenged by it, and we had an obligation to start responding in particular ways. And that meant that we had to, in some cases, wear face masks or do different things. But many people began to volunteer, and that community spirit came to the fore. It was the sort of outpouring of emotion that you saw when people were clapping on the doorstep or when they were supporting their neighbours and friends to get through particular challenges that they were experiencing. As David said, this is the same disruptive event for everybody at the same time, and that was incredibly unusual. We managed to almost understand a lot more about the response to these emergencies from individuals from that. Many people were compliant to the same emergency, many people were less compliant, and we understood a little bit more about how people deal with or how they interact and how they sort of regard democracy and democratic institutions, and began to get an insight into the various ways in which public can respond to emergencies that are almost affecting everybody at the same time. It wasn't people over there are being affected by a flood, I'll need to go and help them. It was very much personally felt in a way that we haven't seen before. And as the title of the slide suggests, this was happening not just in our neighbourhoods or our our cities, but happening across the world. And so we were able to observe almost what was coming, because we were able to see a few weeks ahead what was happening in different countries that were experiencing this. And almost we were waiting for a wave coming, whether it was a wave of going on the down number of infections, or a rise in the number of infections. But we almost saw what was coming ahead of time, which again added to its unusual nature, David.
Yeah, and this also, I guess, one of the reassuring things, a positive that comes out of it, is it also proved that most people can be resilient. You know, there's sometimes when we talk about societal resilience, I think it can sound slightly overwhelming, you know, trying to make everybody completely resilient. The fact is, the positive to be taken from COVID is, you know, at least 80%, maybe more, proved to be completely resilient if given the right information at the right time. So, you know, just want to hold on to that as a positive at the end of it as well. I think
it's a good
sorry,
point.
go on.
Yeah, it's a good point in terms of you know, we asked people to respond, and they responded in the main, and they responded in ways that we didn't even think that they would be able to respond. And as David said, you know, we in the consortium, we use this figure about 80-20. It's not saying that 20% needed help, but 80% were able to respond. It's almost just an approximation that says, when you look out over society, 80% of people are able to help themselves in creative and innovative ways, some of which we can predict and some of which they just take responsibility for. But it's those 20% who need our help. And so what we saw during COVID was the 80% providing support to the 20%, and of course, local authorities and emergency services and the system providing support to that 20% as well. But that 80% just needed a bit of a nudge, a bit of information, a bit of support, and a bit of permission almost to activate their own resilience.
Andrew, I wonder if we just take a little bit of a pause to repeat. It just gives people a little bit of a pause from our voices. Are there any questions that you'd like to share at this point, Andrew, or any issues you want to raise?
At the moment, no questions in the chat, but obviously people at this moment, feel free to please add those. We obviously will have several opportunities throughout the course of the presentation to take questions either in the chat or at the end in terms of Q&A. I guess one thing that I have a question that might be interesting for people to hear, particularly those that are perhaps coming from a research type environment. The non-linearity of it, of the pandemic was obviously mentioned, but what was it like kind of researching within that context, and obviously interfacing with people that are dealing with the response, dealing with the recovery, and I guess something around what that was like as researchers in that particular context, I think would be interesting.
I mean, I can answer the practical bit, and then Duncan, maybe you'd be kind enough as the academic in the room to deal with the research question. So practically what was happening is people had to show greater flexibility and agility to pause some of the early recovery work. So a lot of partnerships, for example, immediately set up parallel recovery groups that would start planning for a recovery, which is the traditional approach, certainly here in the UK. But of course, that then kept on being interrupted as they had to flip back into response, then back into recovery. I think that contributed to a large degree to some of the fatigue around wanting in the end to maybe get back to business as usual a little bit quicker. And it may, we'll come on to discuss it, I think, later, it may also have got in the way of then delivering some of the transformation aspects of certainly the early days of that enthusiasm to not just go back to normal. But Doug, I mean, that's the practical impact of that flip-flopping. How about the research impacts?
Yeah, it's a good question, Andrew. I don't think we were researchers at the time. I think we were just trying to help. And there were so many people who were in the space. It was a really busy space. And we were just, like many people, just mucking in. And yes, we did some interviews, but that was in order to inform the briefing. It was to inform the generation of lessons that we could then share. So it was an incredibly privileged time to be part of this sort of this response. But I'm not sure we were researchers. I think we were just, like many, just trying to help in a different way.
Thank you very much. We do have a number of comments and the question. Obviously, one of the question may kind of preempt some of the later, but David has added to the chat in terms of the UK government and the extent pandemic plans, and obviously about following that process. Obviously, you may come to this later, but this is an opportunity at this point perhaps to address that specific question.
So yeah, UK pandemic planning had been well advanced, I guess, prior to COVID, and indeed exercised significantly in the years leading up to the COVID pandemic. Our focus has been on recovery and renewal, Andrew. So I guess the only comment I would add in is that it felt like those plans tended to not deal so effectively with the recovery phase. And indeed, who would imagine just how long, a challenge recovery would be? But certainly, as we'll deal a little bit later in the presentation, we believe there is a disconnect in the guidance, the planning, I guess the ability to think about what long-term recovery would look like, certainly here in the UK, I think remains a gap and needs revisiting post the pandemic experience. Duncan, do you want to add on to that?
No, I'll leave it with that, and maybe I'll pick up on Liz's question.
Yeah, absolutely, which speaks very much to the point earlier.
Yeah, so Liz, yeah, effectively responders weren't only helping, they were also having to look after themselves and their own families. And I think, again, very unusually, there was no possibility for mutual aid. There was no, you weren't able to ask locally for additional help from different neighbourhoods or regionally or nationally or even internationally, because everybody had different pressures and they were all dealing at the same time. And so nobody was on their own because, of course, everybody was in this together. But very much there was a huge pressure on responders to say, whereas normally you would be asking for some support from elsewhere, that system also needed support. And so perhaps in the biggest way possible, everybody then looked to the public and said, okay, we need your support. We need you to volunteer. And whether it was the NHS responders and that outpouring of people volunteering to do that, or whether it was the new systems that were set up by local government and people volunteering through that. But there was, and that helped to relieve that pressure and that absence of mutual aid from other sources. So again, we saw all, and that was very much some of the catalyst for our work around societal resilience, is thinking that the public emerged in an amazing way when there was no mutual aid available. Of course, that put huge pressure on responders. And David and I were just talking yesterday about how many of the senior staff who we were working with in response have now moved on. They've now found different jobs because the pressure was obviously unrelenting and over such a long period. So yeah, it is a tremendously interesting issue, but one that with a huge amount of sadness associated with it as well.
Thank you, Duncan, David. We do have another question in the chat, but perhaps we'll pick that up at the next opportunity, unless you wanted to focus on that now. But everyone, please feel free to add your questions as we go along, and obviously we will return to them when we have another pause later. So thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. I think we'll save it for later so we can have more of a conversation throughout the presentation. But thank you. Thanks, Andrew. So let's move on then. Let's talk a little bit more, again, carrying on the reflective theme, but then start to look forward a little bit more. So Duncan, I wonder if you would just talk, please, through the slide that we've entitled, what did we actually learn about recovery, renewal, resilience? We'll probably do this together in a discussion piece, but if you wouldn't mind starting, that would be great.
Sure. So this slide very much looks back as to what did we learn, and then later on we'll look forward and look at the implications of that. But around recovery, and I've just seen Rob's comment in the text around, will these change the guidance? Well, I think what we think looking back is that there was a disconnect in the guidance. There was a disconnect, and we didn't even have the vocabulary or the lexicon to be able to describe that recovery probably wasn't enough. The guidelines were focusing on recovery, but as people in the UK know, that they were focusing on recovery to a relatively sort of transactional event, difficult, but not something of the type of COVID that affects everybody in the way that it does. So the guidelines were pretty much developed around flooding or that type of an event. The lexicon was associated with that, as were the planning assumptions, the methodology, and so forth. And what we needed was something very different, because this wasn't about business as usual. This wasn't about putting the lid back on, about dealing with the immediate effects and then getting back to normal. This was very much about learning the lessons, as deeply felt as those were, learning those lessons and thinking about how we can change our society, how we can change how we live and where we live and so forth. And there was a tremendous sort of desire for renewal. That was where people's enthusiasm was. That was where people really wanted to think differently about what their places could be. And
I think it.
Yeah, please.
No, sorry, I was going to say, I think it's fair to say, again, reflecting on Rob's question, maybe, we certainly would suggest that there is a need to just revisit the guidelines and look at the amount of imagination that we can put into these slightly longer term events. Traditionally, recovery gets tested over the first week of an event, very, very rarely exercised. And not a key feature, for example, of the national exercise that preceded the pandemic. So there's certainly room, I think, to reflect back on it and see what we can learn into these future events.
Yeah.
And go, Duncan.
I think recovery is essential. Absolutely, we're not saying that recovery should be done at the expense of renewal or the other way around. Is to say both of these are absolutely necessary. You need to do the recovery, the business as usual work, and then in some cases you need to start doing that reimagining work that can be done through renewal.
So looking at some of the wording on here, Duncan, I guess we need to add a few more explanations. So there was a great appetite for renewal, as Duncan described in the beginning, certainly, albeit the narrative may have changed over the longevity of the pandemic experience. At the beginning, I think everybody felt they wanted the world to look very differently to the one we were experiencing as a result of the pandemic. So, a lot of informal democracy at local level, a lot of people working within resilience partnerships trying to align some of the broader agendas that came into play: health, well-being, public safety, environment, for example, use of open spaces. Looking for alternative narratives about how we can rebuild and reshape on the back of the immediate response to the pandemic, all of course done within the kind of fiscal constraints that most local authorities, most local partners, public sector partners in particular, and indeed I guess the voluntary sector would be facing at the same time. Obviously, the biggest challenge that we discovered here, in fact, it's not only here, but in places like Vancouver and again over in the Palestinian National Authority, was about governance and sovereignty, because what you've got is clearly lots of individual organisations having their own impacts, having their own business continuity challenges, whilst also being expected to work in a multi-agency landscape. And people beginning to discuss, well, hang on, who has the power, who has the influence, who is able to convene agreements about where the priorities might lie. So, the local resilience forums here in the UK, we described earlier on as being very transactional in nature. They are almost explicitly focused on response, or certainly have been historically. They're not used to, nor are they necessarily as occasional partnerships set up to do some of this more transformational, longer term politicking around rebuilding society and resilience. And the primacy of the recovery coordinating group, just to explain the RCG in this is the subgroup within the multi-agency partnership framework whose sole responsibility is to plan for and manage recovery. That group itself was then challenged as to how much it could decide about what the future might look like without having to go into sovereign governance arrangements of local government, for example, amongst just a few. But the realism that it was, there were certainly great pockets in the interviews and our experiences in sitting in on some of these meetings. There were some brilliant localized attempts to do this. Some work within systems very effectively in the UK. Some try to do it within new structures, again, very effectively within UK. But they were pockets, I think would be fair to acknowledge. They were islands of success rather than a comprehensive, structurally driven, supported by national, subnational. It was very isolated down to local leadership, and indeed, in many occasions, personalities and the maturity of political arrangements within a specific LRF. What we didn't see, which was an interesting one, and some of you on the call may have an insight as to why that might have been, we didn't see a great deal of strategic innovation around recovery. In fact, a lot of the innovation tended to be very tactical and operational around, for example, the sharing of information, data, or indeed technical or tactical detail. But we might come back and almost open that question up to the audience, I think. Duncan, would you talk a little bit about the resilience elements of what we learned?
Sure. So here it was around different ways or new ways of working, because of the opportunities that were presented have been quite impressive in terms of different things beginning to emerge. So we've seen corporate learning, of course, we've seen communities, we've seen volunteers, but we've also seen some of these things beginning to be lost. So whilst there was this outpouring of emotion that we talked about at the beginning, obviously people became tired, people became fatigued, and that obviously meant that some of these numbers of people started to dissipate, and learning began to be lost, and learning began to be forgotten around how do we create this resilience. Ownership is something I think that has come to the fore and continues to come to the fore, especially in the UK resilience framework, which is right, who convenes resilience? Not only who joins the dots, but what are the dots? Because resilience is such a large and challenging concept for many places to start to think about. But how do we integrate all of the different agendas, people agendas, place-based agendas, the processes that we see that are running in organisations and across organisations? Where are these all owned in a single place? And of course they're not, because they are disparate and separated across society. But then in that case, how can we build resilience to make sure that the silos that we naturally have in some organisations, that things don't fall between those silos, or indeed those silos don't become so rigid that it's difficult to be able to support cross-working. We really learned that delivery is about instrumental relationships, and this is the term we keep using, is some relationships that places have are incredibly supportive and incredibly positive, but they don't actually do a lot. So they're not instrumental, they don't cause change to happen. And what we've been saying is that those instrumental relationships are absolutely key. It's the organisations that really put effort into making change happen. And they make change happen within a methodology for improvement. And so everybody is working towards the same outcome, and they're working within a shared approach to doing that. And we've been talking about this as the foundations of resilience, and thinking about we need to have new opportunity, perhaps need to understand who has that ownership, but in order to deliver, and these are the foundations that we really need to put if we're going to build a resilient society.
Thanks, Duncan. So let's talk a little bit about how we think we might strengthen or help strengthen resilience partnerships here in the UK. And this slide probably is a little bit more focused here into the structures that we have for reasons that will become obvious to you. But I think some of the learning, to repeat, is still generic. So bear with us while we talk about local issues. So in the UK, we'll go on to share some maps with you that illustrate this quite wonderfully well, I think. Footprints has been a challenge for, well, probably since the inception of the local resilience forum structure within the legal basis here in the UK. So most of these partnerships are based on police boundaries. Those boundaries do not always align with other structures or the key players who have a critical role, health being one of the most obvious, for example, but by no means the only. So there is a challenge here about how we finally address some of the misaligned footprints, how we deal with variations in performance across the numerous partnerships here in the UK. They are often described as being incredibly different in the variety of the performance that they can deliver. And sometimes that very much is about the maturity of their partnership working arrangements. Again, a theme that we'll return to a little bit later on. We also obviously need to think, I think, here in the UK, certainly about the purpose of these partnerships. They are currently, as we've described to you before, for good reason, I think, seen as transactional partnerships. They're very, very good, very effective, as they were in COVID and we described earlier on, at doing the kind of here and now stuff, the urgent stuff, the putting the lid back on the bin, dealing with the chaos, getting some structure, and coming together. They do that incredibly well. But it means that because of the dominant culture within the leadership of resilience forums, it tends to be a very explicit focus on that part of the role, and maybe not as effective as it might be in delivering some of the more integrated parts of the emergency management cycle, and indeed in building and developing strategic resilience. So looking, I think, to help LRFC as a slightly different role, to expand on those roles and try to help them to bring it together as a much more comprehensive strategic partnership, I think would be incredibly useful. We've also experienced throughout COVID in particular, I think, a really good demonstration of how important it is that those brilliant offers that are made at national level and at subnational level or across sectors, for example, even right the way down to the ability of government liaison to provide active and two-way, timely communication. Sometimes we need to make sure that those offers can be delivered effectively at the most local level, because as we've shared with you before, these experiences are always going to be local, even if the challenge is wider than a counter or an LRF. It's people who locally experience it that need the support. So I think redressing some of these three issues, footprints, the very nature and purpose of partnerships, and the ability of those partnerships to dock in and coordinate with other players on the resilience scene, I think is going to become really important. Duncan, are you happy to talk about resilience?
Yeah, and just before we move off of local, I guess one of the really important partners is the voluntary sector that really touch into different neighbourhoods, and they understand the needs that are there, they understand the vulnerabilities that are there in the population. Whether the connection between the voluntary sector and local resilience forums is strong enough at the moment, I think is maybe variable across the country. But certainly the voluntary sector are there with a very rich understanding of what's going on the ground, and can really bring in and complement what's already known within the LRF. In terms of resilience, so society supporting and providing a supportive capability. For those of you who are part of the consortium, you'll have heard us talk long about how society can provide a capability. That means that communities can respond as a resource. So they can provide their intelligence from the ground. They can provide a support in terms of manpower, and in terms of knowledge and skills and resources. So they can really contribute in a way that we saw during COVID that we haven't seen before, as we said. They don't necessarily need to be a burden or be viewed as a burden. And I think that the narrative in the UK has certainly changed hugely from, we need to keep people from behind a tape, behind out of the hot zone, and we can really use and work with society. So we can really work with society very closely, because they own the effects of the emergency. We've seen that happen in really effective places, but we've also seen it happen in ways that we wouldn't want to see happen again, in very recent memory. And Grenfell was an example of where the local democracy and institutions and society didn't work very well together, and instead society were able to really blossom and really take a lot of the activities there. And perhaps we need to learn a huge amount from that experience, because it's a good example of where society can take responsibilities. In terms of aligning strategic agendas, this is all about making sure that the complex fabric of different agendas within a place are in alignment. So it's making sure that we've got understanding about well well-being, about infrastructure, all the services and critical services that are provided, and then going beyond that and thinking about the effects of things that will be that we really need to be taking consideration of, like climate change, like the ways in which our society is changing, and how do we align all of those into an agenda for resilience. And I think that's a hugely challenging issue, David, in terms of just being able to imagine and to be able to think about all of these different agendas and being able to integrate them together in a resilience way, or a way of thinking about resilience.
And also just opening up resilience, you know, that we are seeing, for example, I think globally, certainly here in the UK, a real kind of national shift to describe an imperative to build resilience within communities to all of those future disruptions that may be coming. What we need to do, certainly looking back into the partnership structure, is make sure that that ambition, that national will and drive, aspiration, is mirrored at the most local delivery level, where of course there are lots of other competing agendas too. However, as Duncan's just said, you know, think about the role that those wider kind of agendas play. You know, public safety, you know, health and well-being, certainly on the back of COVID. You know, just making sure we have an infrastructure and a service that can continue throughout disruption. We now understand far more than we ever did before just how pivotal and important that will be. Let's just talk about the nature of partnerships then, Duncan, here in the UK in particular. We've already described them to you, and I think indeed it's almost a quote as described here from some of the interviewees. You know, they recognise that these are currently occasional partnerships of the willing. Some of them are very willing, some of them do all of the work, for example. And we've already talked to you about, look, there is a culture of response focus rather than the broader resilience agenda. But we're seeing here in the UK a piece of work that's very much looking to strengthen the nature of the partnership around its accountability to local democracy. We spoke to you earlier on about how governance, we think, maybe got in the way of effective renewal. So we certainly welcome the strengthening of the accountability to local democratic leaders for Resilience World, but also integrating with some of those broader agendas as well that Duncan's just described, and then looking again at the kind of leadership that can drive forums forward into the future. I think it's an incredibly exciting space for the next few years to see exactly how local resilience partnerships here in the UK adapt and adopt to that very clear message from UK government that they see strengthening LRS as being central. And of course, what that means is we used to ask the question, you know, what does the R stand for in LRF? Does it really stand for resilience, or is it more local response forum? We now clearly accept and recognise that's the wrong question. The question now is, it clearly is going to be the LRF that's going to deliver strategic resilience, or at least be at the heart of shaping strategic resilience. The question now becomes really who else, because local resilience partnerships can't do it on their own. You know, nobody can be resilient on their own is one of the key messages that we take out from this. And then just going back to the middle box a little bit, yep, certainly we acknowledge at the moment agreement and setting local strategy can be challenging for LRS in the moment. Some of the work we hope to be involved in, and certainly some of the work that's set out in the resilience framework going forward, is looking at how we can change that landscape a little bit more supportively to help LRS do that. Duncan, did you want to add into those observations?
I think it's only to use the term sort of opening up a resilience again, and I know we use it a little bit later, but I think what the UK Resilience Framework does is says that resilience is not only the responsibility of the local resilience forum, it's very much opening it up to say it's all of these different agendas, it's all of these different people coming together, yes, within the LRF, but that means perhaps that the partnership needs to expand to accommodate these different agendas. And whilst that might be quite a challenge, that certainly seems to be the direction that government are going in terms of resilience becoming a much richer place.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about, well, what might that look like then? How might they deliver strategic resilience? And you know, we shape our thoughts around three columns. I think you've probably seen the pattern here that's developing. You know, we clearly think there are some building blocks that can be rebuilt or reshaped or indeed reinvented. looking from the legacy of COVID. So yeah, great period of change. You know, it expanded the expectations on these partnerships, and I think they proved themselves able in the short term, certainly during COVID, to be able to reform and adapt to those new ways of working. I think it's, you know, it's important that we all now take a little bit more time to go back to the COVID experience and ask about legacy and how much of that new way of working is now embedded into current practices locally, or indeed, if it isn't, why that might be the case, so we can understand how to unpick that and maybe reshape. Investing in resilience, a big issue for us, as you probably already picked up. We have seen some tremendous financial support for resilience partnerships here in the UK. It's clearly been incredibly useful, but we would like to have a discussion. We would like to encourage partners to have a discussion about some of the longer term funding opportunities. It does tend to be, by nature, prime funding. It does tend to be intended to get things going for a year or two, for example. But of course, strategic resilience is clearly going to need something slightly more. And again, it's not difficult to understand. Clearly, in the immediate aftermath of that intense response period, a lot of partners wanted to spend innovation funding on what was really information data sharing, or indeed gadgets, may I say. We believe there is a more kind of comprehensive discussion we could all have about a slightly wider look of the way we might do innovation into the future, especially if we all agree the focus is on strengthening societal resilience. So, you know, using strategic innovation, using some of the legacies from COVID to try to match that ambition that people are beginning to articulate at national, sectoral, and indeed even local level. We ran a conference recently for the consortium, which just showed there's an absolute groundswell of positivity around the theory, the aspirations of societal resilience. It's about how we can help local partners now convert that into kind of outcomes at the local level. So could you talk a little bit about leadership, which we see as being central?
Yeah, I think that, just building on what David said about that local leadership is absolutely critical, because effectively what you've got is starting to think about resilience differently. And that needs to begin at the leadership level, at the strategic level, but also at the political level, because what we see through the UK resilience framework is this opening up of resilience in a way that it will become more strategic, it will become more political, and it needs to involve democratic leaders in very different ways to how it's been done in the past. It needs a new reshaping and a reconfiguration of the system that seeks to provide resilience. And so what we saw through that document was some ambitious emergences of what LRS might become. We also saw through that document the emergence of this wider agendas, but the alignment of those agendas. So recognizing that those agendas have always existed, but perhaps the alignment of those is perhaps what has been missing. So making sure that agendas that exist in different parts of a local authority, or different category responders, or different statutory agencies, making sure that they align in order to strengthen the system of resilience that is being attempted to be developed here. And then looking at strategic resilience, looking at what we've been calling instrumental relationships, and all with a focus on operationalizing resilience. So rather than talking about it as a theoretical term, rather than trying to get our heads around the academic notion of resilience, is really thinking about it in terms of a capability, and thinking about, well, what are the capabilities that we want to create in our places that help us to prove that we are becoming more resilient. In the context of David and my work, it's around societal capabilities. And so we talk very much about operationalizing societal resilience as a local resilience capability, because we're not just talking about that sort of nebulous concept. We're talking about how do we operationalize it, which is incredibly crunchy, and again, keeping it very strategic. David.
Thank you, Duncan. So, how do we achieve the balance then? Obviously, we're calling for a shift from the kind of response into the wider, broader resilience responsibilities. We welcome that democratic accountability that's laid out here in the UK as being vitally important. How can you do this without having you know, the links into local democratic leaders, people who are responsible, you know, for community impacts, community life and well-being. You know, but who's best placed to do that, I guess, is the really interesting question. Well, we've already accepted it's most certainly the Resilience Forum partnerships here in the UK, and I suspect elsewhere around the globe. It will always be that partnership that will have the lead role, or at least be central to convening some of this work going forward. We believe that there's room for looking again at how we might improve communication, that closer working, two-way communication across all of the levels, be that national, subnational, sectoral, or local. We see you know, again, not surprisingly, a degree of silo working within resilience. You know, how can we make sure that the pull for information from national, for example, is also you know, reflected by the push of information back out in a very timely way? How can we make sure that, you know, all of the levels can be coordinated more effectively across the way? It's something that people learn all the time, you know, as you go through each individual incident, but it tends to be an oft repeated comment on reflecting back on incidents. So a little bit more work to be done, I think. But probably one of the most important bits here, I think, is the skill set that is required to achieve the kind of strengthening changes that we're talking about, and in particular some of the leadership roles around the knowledge of place-based politics, you know, community and response skill set balancing, somebody who can actually bring all of these aligned agendas together in a kind of connected system is going to be, I think, a fascinating challenge for people into the future. And again, we're delighted to share some thoughts about who or what that person might look like. So we're just going to talk a little bit again about some of the complexities, and there's a conversation we want to have, which Duncan's going to expand on hopefully in the next slide, around the differences and the similarities between partnerships here in the UK. And we just want to explain to you why we think the word difference is unhelpful and as maybe on occasions got in the way. Certainly, we want to acknowledge that it's a complex landscape. I've already described to you that most of these partnerships are based on police footprints. The map with the purple is only for England, but is exactly showing that. These are police force boundaries on which these partnerships are based. But just as one example of the complexity, within one of those police force areas, you have actually 3 physical geographic counties. You have 3 million residents. You have 14 different local authorities against the different structures. So unitary, single tier, 2-tier, county councils, a real mixture of local governance, 3 different fire and rescue services, obviously the 1 police service, and then 4 integrated care. So we acknowledge that the landscape is complex, but we would say to you, we think that means there are actually more similarities than you may expect. And Duncan, I think the next slide hopefully illustrates that very well. Oh, sorry. What it would do if I stayed on it. Yeah.
So the next slide is not ours. We borrowed this from another source, but what it does really, really nicely is show the challenges that exist in each of these different areas that we've been talking about. And as David says, there's more similarities than differences. If you look at these almost 20 different dimensions of these footprints don't map on in any of the places that we've got. Now, we do recognise that some places are incredibly complex. They have incredibly complex politics. They have incredibly challenging risks and communities, and they are under different pressures. But by saying that there is more similarities than differences across LRFs, what we're trying to say is that everywhere has complexities, everywhere has different challenges. Some of those challenges are very visible, and some of those challenges are incredibly hidden because they are almost internal challenges that we can't put on a map, we can't write down in the way that David's slide shows. So this slide, I think, really starts to bring home the complexities of the different places, the complexities of these 38 LRFs that are in England, and to say that all of these means that building resilience is going to be a challenge in all of these areas, hence why there are similar challenges and there are more similarities than differences across the LRFs. Dave, is there anything you want to add to that before we move on?
No, I think only, I guess the point we take from it is, look, by describing the similarities as being more positive to the differences, it allows us to talk about consistency.
Yeah.
And again, it's something we want to return to a little bit later. But no, thank you, Duncan. That's a really good, forgive me for those who are not based here in England, but it's a good illustration of probably structures that are replicated elsewhere, I think. So we'll just share this slide, then we'll have another pause, Andrew, for picking up on any questions that have come in before we come to the final part of the presentation, which really brings all of our key findings together, I guess. So some narratives that we think help to open up resilience, and I'll start. Response was universal, consequence management, control measures, a focus on economy, societal health. Response was absolutely brilliant. We want to acknowledge that. We want to celebrate that, to be very clear, certainly here within UK and elsewhere around the globe that we interacted with. But transactional recovery was essential. So that kind of, the basic stuff of supporting people, restoring services, restarting, indeed starting to examine and understand some of the impacts of the needs, trying to eke out the lessons from what we were learning along the way, and appreciating that value of joint working. Those two were absolutely critical throughout COVID. But Duncan, maybe you'd pick up on where that took us into the renewal and the ambitions.
Yeah, so if recovery was essential, then transformation renewal, it was that ambition that David mentioned. And no matter who we talk to across the world, it was always the ambition for renewal that just that shone through. That was not easy, though. Of course, they started to develop new structures around developing and understanding what renewal needed to be. So impact assessments were made, groups were formed to try and interpret and understand those. And then there was the tremendous thought given to the wider strategies that renewal sat in. And then in order to understand how those can all map together. But that was a very complex landscape, again, of bringing in different people into these recovery, renewal, mobilisation meetings. These were not the normal people who were involved in response. So what we saw during response was almost one category or one type of agency and organisation getting involved. And then recovery and renewal started to change who actually got involved in this, right up into resilience. And now we see resilience being, again, started to be think about as to who needs to be involved in this. So who needs to be involved in these conversations and bring their different agendas to the table so that these agendas can all be integrated into us thinking about resilience. That takes us on to the strategic nature of resilience. And resilience can't necessarily be pushed down to a coordinator level. It needs to be dealt with at a very strategic level in the organisation, to think about what is the ambition, to set the ambition, and then to identify the strategy that can support that. And then the delivery of that strategy can become a little bit more operational. But societal resilience or strategic resilience all need to be thought of at the super strategic level in organisations. In terms of our own work around societal resilience, that does mean working with local communities and hyperlocal to understand what is the renewal of societal resilience that they are willing to participate in. It's not about creating an agenda within local government and then pushing that down and then kind of trying to figure out why it doesn't meet the expectations of local communities. It needs to be something that is developed in association with communities. This cannot be thinking about a renewal agenda around societal resilience, at least, that is about us coming up with an answer and then asking everybody to buy into it. It's very much needs to be much more spirit of developing it together so that the demands that will come from an emergency can be supported by the support that organisations and society communities are willing to provide to that. David.
That's great, thank you. So
in terms of opening up resilience, yeah, I'll leave it to you.
Okay, so yeah, so that final challenge again for all of us, and again, this is where our current focus at the consortium is very much focusing in on, is how do we do it then? How do we translate that the rhetoric, if you like, of societal resilience, of the desire, the ambition? How can we now actually help resilience partnerships make that key keynote change, that kind of gear shift, if you like, to go from its current slightly more occasional, very transactional focus into becoming this much more strategic, much more wider, broader, resilience focused set of partnerships, all within the acknowledged landscape that we face of constraints and challenges. But I think there's a great piece of work we can all do together to talk about how do you do it. And that's, again, to repeat, very much where we are with the consortium. Andrew, I think we need to take a very short break from talking, give you the chance to pose any questions. I think because of time, Andrew, we have the last chunk to get through. I'd like to leave a kind of big block at the end for people to come online and ask their questions to us directly. But would you like to pose any that you think are urgent? Maybe 2 or 3?
Well, thanks very much, David. Yeah, there's been some great interaction and comments raised in the chat as you have proceeded through the presentation. I think obviously we left it at the last point at Roberts, and I think you picked up immediately in terms of the presentation on some of the issues around transformational transaction terminology. So Robert, if you don't feel that has been answered, then obviously we'll have the opportunity at the end. We do have several comments that are picking up on some of those issues around hyperlocal and the possibility of local communities as a resource. And I think one of the examples just to pick out, and obviously people can read through the chat, was relating to Cockermouth and one of the response groups set up there after Hurricane Desmond, and how that then subsequently was mobilized in the context of COVID. So very much then seeing how society and groups set up within society can then become integrated within future future major events and emergencies. We do have an early question in the chat in relation to particularly COVID, and in terms of identifying the characteristics of resilient communities in the pandemic. So I just wonder, Duncan, David, then whether that also then neatly leads into some of the obviously terminology and some of the things that the consortium is talking about in terms of societal resilience, and what are those characteristics of resilient communities?
Thank you. Yes, thanks, Andrew. So just to add to Rob's question, I'm not sure I've heard of any enthusiasm or any calls within central government to rewrite or to refresh the recovery guidance. So there's nothing that I know of. In terms of what the characteristics of resilient societies, gosh, I think that opens up a whole different range of issues that we could. I'm not sure we have time to go into at the moment. What I would do is point you to a report that we did for the National Preparedness Commission. And what that began to do was look at some of the examples like Cockermouth, but not Cockermouth, but look at some of the examples of where there was fantastic response within our communities during COVID. And we took 15 case studies and explored the characteristics that they had, and that might be a very short way of kind of trying to address that question. In that report, what we do is we understand what was it that was done, and local leadership was absolutely key. And I don't mean democratic, I don't mean elected, I mean really people on the ground willing to work together and to lead a small group of people to do something that was just magnificent. That was one thing. Of course, the permission and the sort of the in some cases the touch paper of a local government saying, could you just do this, was absolutely key, and almost giving people permission to respond and react in that way. And so they could go and knock on neighbours' doors, or could go and start up their own activity. There are a whole range of different factors. And again, this is something that we're working on within the consortium to understand what are the foundations that need to be in place on which we can layer a local resilience capability. I might just stop there, Andrew, because I could go on for ages.
No, that's no problem. And as I mentioned, there are obviously lots of really great comments, including, Robert again talking about, the need for LRFs, to be in conversations with political leaders in relation to levelling up on those wider agendas. But Debbie Reid has a question. I wonder, David, it might be for you. So she's asking, do you see the starting point of building community resilience, stroke encouraging society resilience, as having community response plans in place? And if so, who do you see driving that? You know, is it from the parish council or somewhere else?
Yes, great question. The easy answer is yes, I do. Community response plans is a great start point to engaging local people to think about their own vulnerability, the risks, and indeed the support they can offer. So absolutely, and it's probably one of the most effective historical approaches to community resilience here in the UK. The challenge, I guess, Debbie, for all of us is it tends to be completed with the kind of easy to reach groups, dare I say. It tends to be those parish councils, those parish ward areas that are already quite active locally, have a very good local community network, and therefore can effectively deal with something like emergency planning a little bit quicker. Or indeed, they're communities that have been affected by a localized event, such as flooding, for example. So some great successes. The challenge, to repeat for me, is, but what about the harder to reach? The lessons from COVID about the impacts were so diverse and really did exasperate some of those pre-existing fragilities and inequities within communities. I think we all, as a group of emergency managers, need to do a little bit more thinking about how do we expand the success of those active local community groups into those slightly less active, or indeed groups that just don't have the capacity or indeed the ability to engage at this point. How do we help strengthen their resilience? Andrew, for me. Duncan, I don't know if you want to add to that, but it's a great question. It's a good start point.
Yeah, so I don't think in the consortium, I don't think we've talked about community response plans. And we've been thinking about it quite differently in terms of creating a capability, and that capability being one that is almost needs to be designed, unless of course it already exists. A community response plan almost suggests that capability already exists at the local level, and so I would probably say, well, as David said, it might be a really useful place to start, but that is very much you're perhaps preaching to the converted, preaching to the people who already understand the importance of this. It might be that the people who don't have those community response plans, that's really the 20% of the people who we are really trying to touch by societal resilience and helping them. Not that we're going to ignore the 80% at all, but as you say, they've already got some preparedness that's in place.
Well, thank you very much. We do have some more questions in the chat, one of which we can come back to at a later point, I think, in terms of bringing people together, the how of bringing people together. But just because we've been talking about community response plans, there's a question from Christine. Just, is there a national register of community response plans? Very quick yes, no answer.
I think the answer is no. The only reason why I'm pausing is that I believe the answer is no. Somebody on the chat room might be able to correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not aware of one. Andrew, I think there's been a lot of work, a lot of calls for local asset registers, for example, but I don't think community plans would feature on that. I wonder if we can just move on very quickly, Andrew, through the last few slides that then gives us the chance to pause again for you to bring in that broader conversation towards the end, really. But I think if we now just describe some of our final thoughts, that might be useful. Do you agree? Are you happy with that?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, so Duncan and I are now just going to share with you our last kind of key learning points that we draw out from the whole experience over the last 3 to 4 years. And then to repeat, we very much would like to have that conversation with you that allows you to question us a little bit more in detail. Indeed, hopefully we can open the video up as well for everybody. So the first thing to share with you is we described this term throughout the COVID experience, really, of meaningful recovery. What we were trying to do was to really understand the nature of recovery in the context of a prolonged public health emergency as being very different from, for example, the kind of recovery described in current guidance, that short-term or localized, or indeed even widespread flooding incident, which has some very specific elements to it. And we just wanted to share with you in this slide some of the key components of what would make it meaningful, or what it would be dependent upon. The first thing we wanted to share with you is that some of the impact needs assessment methodology in the guidance here in the UK, we believe needs a refresh and a revisit, but it's more about why you do it and seeing it as being the commissioning tool for recovery and renewal activity as being the important thing. There was some brilliant work done either by local academics in partnership with LRF or indeed an LRF or county council, local authority based analytics about looking at some of the impacts, both broader and more localized, and some really great data from national. Actually, it's trying to remember that it's all about what you do with that data and how it commissions activity into the future, we think is one of the key pillars of making something that we would describe meaningful in recovery and renewal. We've already talked, I think, to exhaustive levels about why we think aligning agendas, responsibilities and leadership together is going to be critical for driving transformative outcomes in particular. So I'll leave that at that point. And of course, underpinning that, the importance of strengthening the governance for local resilience work. So who is accountable? What is that accountability? How do you measure it? Going back to the previous question about community response plans, for example, how do we describe the value of all of this work that we do during recovery and renewal? How do we capture the actual outcomes as a benefit to society, as well as just purely understanding whether the activity was effectiveness in the first place? And then that piece about just going back to the guidance where the time is right, with partners here in the UK in particular, based on the ISO that we shared with you, the international standard, sorry, that we shared with you earlier on, and just review our current thinking, have a really good conversation about the adequacy of the guidance for these slightly more challenging, more prolonged, more widespread, complex health-led pandemics and other health-led emergencies. Duncan, would you just talk or start the conversation, please, around what we describe as intelligence resilience, and I'll pick up a little bit on it.
Yeah, so this is very much about trying to target resilience and trying to understand where are the challenges and trying to create capability that can address those challenges. So we're working in a number of places, trying to understand the needs of particular communities, and then how can those needs be addressed, either within the communities, by members of the public that are elsewhere, by other organisations, by the voluntary sector, or by a capability that's created that begins to unite all of those aspects together. We're looking and thinking about how do you build something, but build it that's in proportion. So how do you create a resilience capability that's in proportion to the risk, that's in proportion to the need? And so then obviously community risk registers exist, but then some understanding of what that need is absolutely key. And then looking at where that need can be addressed, either by the community that surrounds the need or by a different capability that has to be created. And just moving quickly through this slide, but thinking about evaluation and thinking about innovation around that, we think that that's absolutely key. Is how do you know when these interventions are making a difference, potentially to do different aspects? How is the intervention actually created, and the evaluation of the intervention itself, and then evaluation of the impact that the intervention has on the ground to the people who are meant to be receiving positive support from it. So this is all around the notion of intelligent resilience, of really targeting, evaluating, and then developing based on all of those, all of the intelligence that's coming in. David.
Yeah, and I love that point, the keeping it in proportion, Duncan. Yeah, we find that people find the talk of societal resilience to be exciting, but quite overwhelming. We really do think this is about thinking smartly about what needs to change, starting small, building big from there. So yeah, just a bit of reassurance, really. We think you can keep this into a structure and proportion that will be helpful. Again, just continuing the theme about intelligent resilience, we've already shared with you, it's understanding that all the experiences are always going to be local. That's the best place to start. The hyper-local impacts, the community impacts that are going to be so critical to rebuilding after events and indeed to strengthening resilience going forward. We've already, I think, shared with you that changing narrative, that growing consensus behind whole of society resilience, but we've also shared with you why we think it's quite useful to really concentrate in on seeing society as a really resilient capability and building from there as a way of starting to manage it. You know, we know that for years now, for decades here in the UK, for example, people have really liked the idea, really engaged with the idea of community resilience, but they've struggled to deliver it. It's normally fallen at kind of short-term initiatives, or indeed been limited to the way we communicate with members of the public, or indeed those easier to reach groups that have been accessible and have worked with local partners. What do we need to do next, I think, is the exciting challenge, and very much where our headspace is through the consortium. We're working with partners to develop a kind of how-to methodology, a manual, a toolkit for people to start turning some of the rhetoric of all of this into the reality on the ground as a positive outcome for society. You know, you can't be resilient on your own is the key message here. Nobody should be expected to be doing this on their own. It's not one short-term contract. It's not one small unit. It's got to be a system that interconnects together with, you know, all of our broader partners, business, across sectors, voluntary community. Everybody has a fantastic offer to add into this. It's just about trying to bring everything together. And again, very much about what the consortium is trying to deliver, but I won't bump that up any more than I have done already. And then just finishing off that piece of a conversation with you about the learning we take away from this, aligning behind the ambition, getting everybody to join up, everybody to convene the dots, everybody to get behind the national political imperative to do this. You know, yes, we acknowledge that governance, getting agreement and strategy is currently problematical for some, not all, but for some UK partnerships. You know, the strengthening programme here in the UK, the work we're trying to do with the consortia and indeed across other parts of brilliant work here in the UK is all about trying to help them overcome those obstacles. And Duncan, just go back again, please, because I think it's critically important, that point you were making about similarity and differences.
Yeah, well, the similarities are many, and it mentions a large number of them on the slide here, so I won't go through them all, but saying that, you know, there are similar obligations, there's similar types of partners, there's similar challenges, there's similar but different politics. There's unifying frameworks, similar language and similar perceptions as to what all this can be and should be. And there's an ambition that's outlined in the UKRF that establishes a similar vision as to where we're heading. There are differences, of course, and there are differences as to how those are locally felt. So there are different politics, but there are still politics. And what we're saying is that, yes, these similarities are actually, as David said, much more useful to think about what the similarities are, because then that helps us to identify what needs to be present. What are the foundations for this, for building resilience? What are those foundations that need to be present in these partnerships? And then how do we create those, and how can we use the learning from other places that are similar to us? How can we use that learning in order for us to make even more inroads onto resilience within our own places? We know that resilience is hyperlocal. We know that when we talk about vulnerability, we're thinking about individuals, we're thinking about businesses, we're thinking about organisations that are challenging. So resilience is this hyperlocal concept, and because of that, we need to aggregate at some level, and the LRF and the Local Resilience Partnership seems to be a useful level to coalesce resilience around. But that means that we're putting a focus on LRFs to be that place for convening resilience and convening all of those different aspects and different strategies and priorities around resilience that we've talked about already. This means that it's really important to align all of these different people that we've been talking about over the last hour, and all of the different politics that exist behind this notion of taking a strategic approach together and developing a plan for resilience, David. I think we've got one final slide.
Yeah, so we really want to land on this final slide. If you asked us to really boil this down to what we believe are the three key pillars to refining the whole ecosystem for societal resilience globally, so applicable not just here in the UK, but elsewhere, based on our own experiences of working with other countries, we absolutely believe that the importance of national coherence shouldn't be understated. You know, you do need a coherent, well-articulated policy framework, legal basis that says that societal resilience is a political aim for communities within a country or an area. That, of course, needs to then be underpinned by guidance, the development capabilities, the investment in resources, you know, and the coordination that we've spoken about all the different levels to make sure that it's a non-competitive space, a very coherent, joined up, you know, everybody trying to achieve the same outcome is probably the critical first pillar. We've talked very much about this joining up and it being broader than just resilience partnerships. You know, it's a wider set of thinking here. And of course, we've already spoken about the interdependency, the interconnectivity of people, place, processes. So systems cohesion is the second central pillar to redefining the ecosystem, making sure that it's all joined up together. The last one, which is where our headspace is going forward, very important, driving that local consistency based on an understanding that there are more similarities than there are differences is the key way forward. So reshaping some of the partnerships in the UK, the nature partnership working, you know, translating practice and standards in a consistent way, you know, a little bit of local alignment, collaborations, which of course the consortium and the others are driving very well. And then just talking about where there are, you know, where there are some issues around footprint and immaturity of some of the working arrangements, talking about leadership configuration, the way business is done to improve that final pillar. So I'm going to leave you with that slide before clicking off. You know, this is what it all boils down to for us. These three things are absolutely essential if we're going to rebuild and refine that ecosystem that I think everybody acknowledges is going to be vital, critical for societal resilience. So Duncan, I want to thank you for the inputs. Andrew, I'm going to stop sharing screen and hand over to you to manage hopefully an interactive conversation. Very happy to see people online.
Hi, David, Duncan. Yeah, thanks very much. A really fantastic presentation, and obviously we've had some great comments in the chat as well as questions asked. Obviously, previously, in terms of the pause for questions that we've had, it's been through the chat function, but I think ideally now it would be fantastic for us to see people and for people to verbalize their own their own questions and comments. Just to put on notice, there are a couple of questions that I think I'd like to come to, if possible. So one is from Alison Sayer. There's another from Ja. I'm sorry, I don't have your full name, but you have a question in relation to how bringing people together and how resilience can be used. So it would be fantastic if you were both able to verbalize your questions when I come to you. Just to note some of the comments that people have made. First of all, there have been quite a few comments throughout the course of the presentation in relation to resourcing being critical. So people coming from different perspectives, obviously underlining that. There's also a really excellent point from Marcus in relation to the importance of relationship mapping, as well as perhaps some of the other mapping that could be done in terms of assets and in terms of the availability of community response plans. There's also an excellent point then in relation to the importance of succession planning, you know, particularly within organizations and local government, etc. I think Alison, perhaps to come to you first, if you are able and willing to either come off mute and or come on camera to verbalize your question, and I know you also had a comment as well.
Hello, everybody. I'm not quite sure exactly what you want me to be addressing now. I did make a point that one of the things I didn't actually say is I think perhaps there's a misunderstanding of what LRFs are and what we can actually do. We have a secretariat who's one person, and the rest of the LRFs are essentially individual people, emergency planners, people with contingency responsibilities within their own organisations. We all have our day jobs. We come together. I'm from Norfolk. There's another couple of people from Norfolk on the call. We come together once a week, we have a strategic overview, we have horizon scanning, we have all of that. We don't have the ability, generally, to influence policy. It is extraordinarily difficult to get the attention of senior managers in any organisation and to try and push a strategic agenda to shift policy, to move things forward. We don't have a structure for that. There needs to be something above. There needs to be a meta thing. There's something, and that's what we're missing. In terms of community resilience, I was very interested in what you were saying about the 80-20. Honestly, community resilience is a tough nut to crack. It always comes down to individuals. Yes, we acknowledge that there's the difficulty of getting to those people, and the ones that you really want to get to, the most vulnerable, are quite often those people who are least likely to engage with something. We're happy to get the 80%. Good Lord, we'd be delighted with 80%. And we chase the 20 later. My big question to you is a very specific question. Was you talking about some standards, and we do have UK resilience standards for local resilience forums. It didn't sound as though you were aware of those. Do you think that they need to be changed? I do acknowledge that they're a little bit light on recovery, and you're right in that most of the stuff is directed around a very short duration event and not globally all-encompassing, which is interesting because we've had pandemic plans, and it's not the first time we've had a pandemic, but it's out of people's understanding. Do you think that the UK resilience standards actually do need to be revised? And how would you anticipate that nudge being given now that there is a bigger push in the UK towards a sort of more being prepared? But it's very much the preparedness end rather than response end. It's nowhere, it's even further away from the recovery end. How would you see that actually being addressed, please?
Could you? Yeah, the first thing about standards, we're very aware that they exist. As we haven't gone down the route of talking about standards today, we talked very much about guidance. So I guess in our minds we were thinking that would encompass, all aspects of the guidance, including the standards. With the community resilience one, I guess the question that you hold the mirror up to is, did community resilience work? Was it successful? And you've already described to us two very important reasons why you feel it may not have been as successful as it might be. One is about that kind of the nature of the partnerships, the leadership, the strategic buy-in. The other one is about resourcing. So I think the standards have a great role to play here, but I wonder if they actually reflect the reality of what's being delivered and actually go deep enough around outcomes rather than process. Duncan, that's the only immediate response I would have. If you want to come in on the back of that.
Yeah, so yes, absolutely aware that the UK resilience standards exist. I sat on the panel that developed them, and so I know intimately the content of 4 or 5 of the standards. I do think that they would benefit from a refresh for 2 reasons. One is that we have learned more about these situations and contexts that are described in the standards. And secondly, our ambition is even higher now than it was when we wrote the standards. What was it? Probably 5-6 years ago we wrote the standards, maybe less. So I think that refreshing the standards is a really good idea. What I don't quite know is the priority of rewriting the standards versus absolutely everything else. And so we've talked about, Chief Resilience Officer. Well, should they be in post before we start refreshing the standards? So almost the interconnectedness of these different parts of the puzzle that are needed to progress resilience. I haven't given any thought yet to the order in which these things should be done. So just because the standards wouldn't get refreshed in the next couple of years, say, doesn't mean that they shouldn't be refreshed, but it might mean that we need to do some things before we refresh the standards because it just makes sense to do those other things first.
The only other reflection, Alison, I'd share with you is that wider point about, I guess, I think you were describing almost an isolation of some of the emergency management, efforts within a strategic landscape. There are areas in the UK, it would be fair to share with you, that do it very, very well. actually do align some of those strategic initiatives together. So, within the Resilient Cities Network, people on the call will recognise me talking about the role that places like Greater Manchester, where they link into the kind of wider, broader landscape of strategic management, bring some of those agendas together very, very well. Or indeed, places similar to Lincolnshire, just reflecting on my own experiences of actually bringing together all of the key strategic leads around the single cause issue of East Coast flooding as a way of engaging strategic direction to drive some of the emergency management effort, for example, was incredibly successful and enjoyable. But it does depend on that work of changing the governance, changing the configuration of how LRS, I guess, do their business. What we didn't want to do, Alison, you'll forgive us, is by any way lecture other people about, how to do that. That's something that we need to keep clear of. But I certainly, to reassure you, we have seen it done very successfully. It does often require a core celeb. It does require, a major event to get people together. Well, COVID, I guess, has been the largest that all of us have faced. So looking at the government, strengthening agenda, looking at the goodwill that we're seeing expressed by most people, it feels like now is a good time to revisit some of that vacuum that you may feel that you're stuck in. I'm not sure that's a very satisfactory answer to you, Alison. I appreciate in your context it may not be, but we have seen this work better together.
Thank you for that. I do agree that it's very definitely helpful to have some emergency events to keep people on point.
Thanks, Alison. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much. Ja, I don't have your full name, but you have a number of how questions that I think would be interesting. So, yes, go ahead. You're on camera.
Yes, good evening. My name is Jonathan Abrahams and I'm calling from Australia, or tuning in from Australia. So it's a bit late in the evening. Thanks very much for the discussion. Of course, this is one of the paramount issues that we're all facing globally. What I was picking up from the conversation, and this is also part of my ignorance in terms of how the resilience committees are working in the UK, but it did sound like it was very much in the response and recovery mode. And I know you are adding to that renewal and transformation and so forth, which is very important. I also appreciated the way that you were referring to continuity. And I think that's very much needs to be coming out increasingly so, because in terms of resilience, it's really continuity of functions, continuity of what's going on, for example, within health services and health facilities. So these are some of the points that I resonated with. At the same time, I was hearing what sounded like quite high level observations. And so that was the how question, was how do you bring people together? And how do you do it in a far more proactive way? Why is it, or how is it, that the emphasis in what I was hearing was very much, it's about the event having happened, and therefore that's when the resilience kicks in, so to speak. That's what I was hearing, at least, but I'm not sure whether that's actually a reflection of the reality. And then, of course, the challenge is we don't need to wait for events in order to build resilience. How can we build that sense of community, that community cohesion in advance, such that it actually has a avoidance, preventative and preparedness effect, such that that also sustains the capacity over time, dealing not just with, let's say, larger scale events, but also with the day-to-day and the routine and how that can be mainstreamed more effectively. So I was just looking for some more perhaps practical examples coming from your experience and observations and research. Thank you.
Thank you.
David, do you want me to go, or do you want?
Yeah, you start, Duncan. Thank you.
So, Jonathan, I think it's a really good point of very often people talk about what you should do and why you should do it, but not how to do it. And this was absolutely at the core of us establishing the consortium, which was there was policy told us what to do, but not how. And so the consortium wanted to come together to identify, right, how do we actually do this? What is step one? What's step two? And so on. And so what we did is spend the last year thinking about this in terms of creating a manual. And so what we now have is the fourth or fifth draft of a manual that we've been developing along with most of the LRFs in the country about how do you actually build societal resilience, not only as a response or recovery mechanism, but in that preparedness mode as well. And lots of the sort of the language or the nuances that we've been talking about today have been both from that work as well as from the recovery and renewal work. So apologies if that's sort of got slightly sort of entangled. But the manual effectively takes partnerships through 8 steps. And the first step, for example, is to align. So to get everybody onto the same page in terms of what is it that we're wanting to achieve, and using that as the basis. So the first place is not, let's develop a leaflet, let's develop a website. The first place is not something as operational or something as transactional as that. The first place is, let's get alignment across our partnership as to what it is that we actually want to achieve. And then there's a whole series of steps that follow on from that. And we're working in different places to test and trial that 8-step model that we've got, and we'll have some more information on that probably after summer in the UK. We recognise that the issue of how is absolutely key. We are making lots of progress on it, and you know, if you want to reach out, then very happy to share with you the manual once it's available for wider dissemination.
David,
thank you very much, Duncan. Thanks. That will be most useful to have a look at the manual. Thank you. David,
did you have anything else to add, or happy to?
No, I thought it was a really good answer from Duncan. Thank you to him. But communicating risk, of course, is always the big challenge. We have some very effective websites. We've had some really good, short-lived but really good leaflet campaigns, for example, trying to alert people to the risks in their local communities, but they tend not to have been effective or longer term or had a long-term impact in changing people's behaviour. So I think there's another piece of work, and I can't answer the how to do that bit yet because it's early doors, I think, Jonathan, around how do we engage people in an understanding of the risks they face when they leave the front door, not sometimes some of those existential threats, but what is it that they see in front of them in the journey they make every day that can have a slightly more engaging conversation about understanding risk and what they can do themselves to avoid being exposed to it, or indeed prevent or respond to it more effectively. But no, great answer from Duncan. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David and Duncan. So we have another question, and unfortunately, obviously, within the confines of the time that we have, this is perhaps our final question. But there is a question from Christine in the comments. So Christine, if you're able to come off mute, then that would be fantastic if you could verbalize.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, my camera might not be working. Hang on a minute.
That's okay. That's okay. No,
okay, it might come on. So yeah, so my question was really about, obviously the language is quite it can be quite complicated around resilience, and I'm just wondering whether you've kind of almost intentionally talking about societal resilience, and do you mean something different from that than community resilience, or are they kind of the same thing but by a different name? And I'll also just throw in really briefly around, I work in public health, and a lot of what you're talking about today really kind of resonates around that agenda around public health, and I suppose really just to advocate for that engagement with public health teams, excuse me, and local authorities, because what you're talking about really is their bread and butter, and that kind of recovery stage, you could also think of it really as being about prevention and how do we strengthen resilience without that necessarily needing to be in response to something bad just having happened. So I think there's real synergies there, and expertise in local areas around some of the concepts that you're talking about through public health teams.
Thank you very much, Christine.
Look, do you want to deal with the language issue first? Because I think you've done a lot of work on defining societal resilience.
So we see societal resilience and community resilience is slightly different. That community resilience is part of societal resilience. But community resilience tends to be talking about the individuals or the community groups within the places that we live. And we think that societal resilience is broader than that. It's looking at the involvement of voluntary sector in those conversations. It's the involvement of businesses and local businesses, of critical infrastructure that supports vulnerable people, of the critical services that they rely on. And so we think that societal resilience is a broader term. We don't go as far as whole of society resilience, which is what the UK government resilience framework is advocating, because we think that that takes the spotlight away ever so slightly from the 20% who are just so vulnerable that they need some additional support. Not that it is 20%, but whatever that percentage is. So, which is why we say it's about society. It's about all of the fabric within society that can support those vulnerable people. And then we can start to break down the concept of some of those live in communities, absolutely. Some of them are the businesses that support those people. So we see them as slightly different, but not uncomplimentary at all. David, do you want?
Yeah, thank you. I think there were two really good points, Christine. The one I really want to pick up on is the one about public health and its role, its position within this. I had the absolutely great fortune to work with a brilliant director of public health in Lincolnshire, who gave so much leadership around the whole kind of East Coast flooding agenda, which for us was the core SLEB that I spoke about earlier on with Alison. I'm totally with you. It's an interesting debate going forward about leadership within strengthened LRFs. I have a view about place-based community knowledge. Actually, wouldn't it be great to see a director of public health taking that kind of strategic overview role, somebody who really does have the ability to think about prevention, because prevention, of course, is central to public health work. So it's a great point that you've raised. And I also acknowledge your point. Look, you're already in this space and doing some great work. We look to see the public health agenda reflected in the work that we're doing within the consortium. So yeah, thank you for the reminder of that. A really good point.
Well,
Thank you.
Thank you, Christine, and to everyone. We have just about a minute left, so I think this is probably the time to wrap up this Q&A session. So with apologies to Marcus and others who have comments within the chat, but I think it's been really valuable contributions that you've all made and really fantastic questions. So thank you for your engagement. So I'll pass over to Duncan and David.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for managing those conversations. Thanks to everybody who's contributed. Final words from me is, well, thank you very much for your time, frankly. It's great to see you all. Thank you for listening. We hope it was useful. Duncan, anything you want to end by saying?
No, I just echo your thanks. We see in the chat there's such an engagement around the topic. So maybe watch out for other events that we might be putting on. Those come out through the consortium, also through LinkedIn, and through the University of Manchester, through the Manchester briefing that we share. So yeah, thank you very much for your engagement.
Thank you all.